Thank you, Steve and Emma and Richard for the generous introduction. It's great to fly across the pond to be able to deliver the inaugural lecture. I'm excited to hear some of your thoughts. I thought what I would do is to kind of give a high-level sketch of my recent book, but also implications beyond, as reflected in the title of Confronting the Challenge of Social Change in Crime and Punishment, including, at the end, I'll talk about some international implications. But what I thought I'd do before getting into the research design and findings is just tell you a little bit about the motivations, intellectual motivations or history, as it were. And I think of it actually as multiple challenges. In a way, it's sort of sequential in my own work because the first, and I'm glad you mentioned Crime in the Making, is what I think of as the life course challenge. And here with John Laub, the central idea was really looking at individual life courses and transitions through time, and maybe think of it as the idea of similar individuals, similar early life risk factors, yet different outcomes because of turning points. Whether that be, for example, marriage, employment, military service, or brutal incarceration. There's a number of things that we looked at, and we followed that further, a subset of the men, and these were men born in Boston in roughly around the Great Depression. So it was more or less a single cohort design following men through the same time in history, again, focusing on turning points through life all the way up to age 70. The second challenge that I've spent way too much time on, perhaps, is neighborhoods and neighborhood effects. And in 2012, published Great American City, Chicago and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect. And you might think of this as similar individuals, different neighborhoods, and therefore different outcomes. We can talk about counterfactuals and causality later if you want, but that's sort of the simple idea. And really argued there that neighborhoods are a fundamental organizing dimension of social life. Today I want to talk about the social change challenge, but actually it's not in any way denigrating or eliminating the prior. It's actually, I think of it as just overlaying all of this, that neighborhoods, for example, are a conduit through which macro-historical change influences lives. And so I kind of view this as sort of the unfinished business. It's always been in my head. And of course, social change is important. We all know it's important. I mean, yet in a way, I argue that it's sort of like, it's in the air, but we don't take it as seriously as we should in our theories. So let me now couch this in some data and take you back to the 1990s and before, which was a traumatic time in the United States. These trends were happening actually in a lot of places. I'll come back to England and Wales later. But crime was going up at a tremendous pace. I guess the laser doesn't work on this mirror, but anyway, you can see the doubling and tripling and more of violence. This is U.S. aggregate, just overall violence crime. Incarceration started to go up a little bit later, 1975, known as mass incarceration. The design of the study that I'm going to talk about that I worked on with many other people. This is a collaborative project that started in the late 80s and planning in early 90s. And this is when we were designing the study. And it was a time of urban crisis, and people wanted to know what was going on, and policymakers wanted to know about career criminals. The term super predator was put out there, I believe, in 1995. And so that was sort of the intellectual moment. And we never knew what was going to happen. Let me just read a few words from the beginning of the book. By conventional measures, Darnell Jackson's future looked bleak. Born in 1995 to a single mother on welfare in an impoverished and racially segregated neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, he entered a world of near record murder rates and surging incarceration. Yet Darnell was lucky in ways that no one at the time predicted, including us. The year of his birth marked a turning point. Violence had begun a dramatic decline that would continue throughout his childhood, not just in his neighborhood, but across Chicago. Lead contamination, known to impair child development, had dropped even more sharply. Crime-related arrests began falling around 1995. And by the time Darnell reached his mid-20s, incarceration rates had sharply decreased. Time's arrow had been unexpectedly in his favor at crucial developmental stages. Andre Lewis was likewise raised by a single mother living in poverty in the same impoverished, literally the same neighborhood, in the segregated South Side. He had all the risk factors as Darnell, in other words. But in 1995, he was already 15 and less graced by history. And in fact, when he was 15, the actual peak in Chicago was a couple of years later of violence. His early childhood unfolded during that massive rise, chaos of the late 80s, crack epidemic, gang violence, and you name it. Like Darnell and Andre, we do not choose our times or how they will change. And this study is about not just two people, it's about cohorts of children. And I use Darnell and Andre in the beginning to sort of capture the essence of the story. But again, it goes beyond. And another contemporary of Andre shook the city, actually. And this, again, was at the time we were planning a study in 1992. Dontrell Davis was a young boy, 7 years old, actually, walking to school with his mother, hand in hand on a sunny day in the morning, and was shot to death by a gang member trying to take out a rival. One author, a well-known author in Chicago, who wrote a book, The High Risers, about Cabrini Green, where he lived, said Dontrell Davis changed Chicago forever. The very place that he was shot has haunted me ever since. This is what it looks like today. This is actually a picture from the book. You can't quite see it, but there's people walking their dogs. There's new apartments. It's sort of a yuppified, if you use that term here, neighborhood, gentrified neighborhood. This looks nothing like it did when Dontrell was shot. So massive changes. So that's really the motivation of the book, to examine how these and other social changes shape life trajectories. What are the mechanisms and what are the implications? In short, and just to read one more paragraph, the core puzzle I address is the link between individual development and social change. The two are intertwined, and the question has challenged thinkers for millennia. Around 500 BCE, the philosopher Heraclitus captured this truth in his aphorism that no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. To focus exclusively on the individual or societal level is to miss the fact that as we age, time marches on. While this interplay seems obvious, and it is in hindsight, scholars of crime, character, and human development have struggled to study systematically how one specific moment in history flows shape life's path. And there's a lot of individual life history research, which I've done, and there's a lot of great research. There's a lot of macro level research. It's bringing the two together. So this book combines original long-term data on multiple birth cohorts to tackle the long-standing challenge of disentangling individual from large-scale social change. And I'll tell you in a minute about tracing the lives of many children who, by the lottery of when they were born, grew up at different times during the remarkable transformation of crime, punishment, and social inequality. I argue that by following children like Andre and Darnell over 25 years, examining both their origins and life trajectories into early and mid-adulthood, I show how individual lives and historical change intersect. In its strongest form, I argue that when we are makes us who we are. So that's the thesis. One sentence thesis. There you go. And you can see how that's different than just the life course and just neighborhood. It's the birth lottery of history. So let's move on then to the research design, which is incredibly important. I'm going to skip over it, but data are theory. I pound it into my students that the design of a study is everything. And this is the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. It's now, still going. So I've been at it for a long time, again, with many people. It's got a cool design, I think, which we did not really appreciate at the very beginning of the study. It's called a sequential cohort design. What do I mean by that? It is the fact that multiple cohorts of children, age cohorts, were enrolled starting at infancy, literally, women were pregnant or they just given birth pretty rare in social sciences to have an infant birth cohort. Then spaced at age 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, and 18. I'm focusing on the infant 9, 12, and 15-year-old cohort that we followed all the way through. Started out with about 6,200 kids. Intense assessments of child and parent, psychological, sociological, you name it. We could talk more about the kinds of measures, but I don't want to get into the detail. The point is that you can see that different developmental stages here are happening at different years or historical times. And calendar years mean nothing, of course, and you can array across the top, which I do in the book, the sort of historical moments that were happening, and I'll come back to that as well. However, in the long-term follow-up, we went beyond just the interviews and surveys to individually match criminal history data. So we have data on official criminality every year of their lives, actually every day if you consider day of arrest. Match death records from the Centers for Disease Control, so we now know mortality. I'll talk a little bit about that. Lead exposure, known toxin, matched it at an individual level to the children, infant birth cohort, and also at the neighborhood level to get a sense of environmental inequality. And then finally, neighborhood data and census surveys observations. The baseline sample was a representative probability sample. We're not just studying the poor. We have black middle class, black poor, white middle class, Hispanic middle class, and so forth. In other words, it's a stratified design by race and socioeconomic status at the neighborhood level. This is a nice little movie, if you will, of the movement of the people as we go through time, 5 different waves of data collection, and then a most recent residential follow-up in 2024. What you can see is that people are moving across the country, and in some cases, if you watch closely, moving back to Chicago. And we collected data no matter where they lived. Okay, that's it, the research design. So we can move on to results. So the first set of results I want to talk about is criminalization of the state, official arrests, and incarceration. Although what I'm going to show you is mostly arrest. And we can then ask the question, well, why arrests? First of all, in the criminal justice system or criminal legal system, it initiates processing, right? You cannot be convicted unless you're arrested. You can't be incarcerated unless you're arrested. And there's a lot of interesting research in the US now, tons on the collateral consequences of incarceration, and more so now on the collateral consequences of arrest. And it has enduring consequences for inequality. I'm not going to focus on this so much. I can refer you to the literature, but even in our own data. So for example, if you think about the problem of incarceration and the well-known racial inequality in incarceration, it's about a 2-to-1 differential, African Americans incarcerated relative to Hispanics and whites. But when you control for arrests, that differential is eliminated. Now that doesn't mean there's no bias, because you can have bias in arrests. It just means that arrest is a key marker, official criminality, that is very determinative of what's happening later in the system. So that's one reason. Another reason, there are more. It's a recent paper that I emphasize in the book. There was also the extended analysis published in Sociology of Education, is educational attainment. College is one of the key stratifying forces in the United States, but really I would imagine in many other countries, including here. And arrest is negatively associated with graduating from college. We know that leads to high school dropout, but even conditional on entering college, arrest has about a 20% association with lower educational attainment. Moreover, this is true of all key demographic groups. And what we called it the great leveler, in the sense that the deleterious consequences of arrest for educational attainment obtained for blacks, whites, Hispanics, males, females. There's some variation, but it's not really significant. All groups. So again, arrest is crucially important, and I think that's probably not controversial. And there's been a lot of research on it. I'm now going to sort of push it back and say, well, what about the sources of arrest, particularly from this perspective of the birth lottery history, or the argument of when, not who, or I'll pose it as a question. Here is the age graded pathways of each cohort, which again now you can do. In the book I actually put the years here. It's a little messy when you're doing PowerPoint, but you can sort of intuit here that, for example, this is the younger cohort, the dots, these lines, and they're about 10 years apart from here. So we're not talking about generational differences so much as cohort differences within the millennial generation, and huge differences in arrest on the order of 100% higher. And you see the familiar age crime criminalization curve, which if you didn't see, you shouldn't believe the data. They are here, but they are clearly cohort shaped. And what happens then when we adjust for a long list of what I'll call the usual suspects, demography, and there's lots of theories about why cohorts could and do vary in terms of things like demography, early life individual risk factors, family characteristics, neighborhood characteristics. I have a table of all the control variables, which is really messy and hard to read. I'm happy to talk about that. But the key is that the second panel on the right shows the age arrest trajectories essentially independent of those usual individual, family, and neighborhood risk factors. And what you can see in the red arrow is meant to indicate that as sort of the effect of social change, if you will. In other words, the birth lottery of history here shown in this particular manner. And again, it's very large. You notice a bit of a diminution, but the older cohorts are actually brought a little bit more together, and so it really is not changing all that much. Furthermore, the advantage of the multi-cohort study is also that one can look at some of the classic risk factors in interaction with social change, or inter-cohort differences and intra-cohort pathways, if you will, to be a little bit technical. But let's take probably one of the most well-known correlates of arrest, or delinquency anyway, which is disadvantage. This is a scale defined as poverty and unemployment and a number of indicators of the family, parent. And disadvantaged kids in the older cohorts have higher arrest rates than disadvantaged. Disadvantaged have higher rates than the advantaged kids in the older cohorts. That's kind of expected. But what we see is that for the younger cohorts, that diminishes. The gap is reducing. And that goes against a bit of sort of common wisdom that things are always getting worse. Actually, for disadvantaged kids, it's better to be later in this stream of history in Chicago and elsewhere. It's kind of a positive message here in some ways in terms of the data, and that's why I'll come back to intergenerational inequality. And it's actually the case that those that gained the most were disadvantaged minority youth. If you look at low SES kids, it's a tremendous difference. In other words, about 60% of the older black cohort members were arrested compared to only about 25% of the disadvantaged younger cohort. So clearly, think of it as Bill Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged. We're gaining over time in the sense of probability of arrest, which through its collateral consequences, I think is a meaningful finding. And actually jibes somewhat with, or it does actually, with some recent research by Raj Chetty and others on racial differences and intergenerational inequality, where there's been improvements. So some surprising findings here. And furthermore, if we start to think of even more individual characteristics such as self-control, which is one of the most venerable, long-standing findings in criminology. I've written on this before. And I think the data are clear. And Michael Gofferson, we commissioned an article in the Annual Review of Criminology, which will be coming out in January, reviewing the literature. It's just the fact, I think, that low self-control kids have a higher probability of getting into trouble, getting arrested. And in my data, or in our data, this is true. You can see that low self-control kids have higher arrest rates than high self-control kids. So that's verified, but I'm just asking us to look at this differently, sort of conceptualize this differently, and can do that by just drawing that line, which tells us, yes, there are individual differences in self-control, but the high self-control kids of the older cohort essentially had the same arrest rates as the low self-control kids of the younger cohort. So that, to me, is sort of flipping things around a bit. You know, is the glass half full, half empty? As someone interested in the macro, I'm pushing not anti-individual so much as the structure matters, because if you think about it in terms of the trajectory or the life course, knowing that someone is a low self-control kid does not necessarily inform us about the level of criminality of that children. It's the social change or the historical context through which they come of age that matters. And so to me, that intersection of one of the most interior of our characteristics of social change is an important theoretical factor and empirical fact to take into account. Okay, that's the criminalization part. And I know I'm going, kind of fast, but I want to get a lot of it in so that we can have a discussion. That's criminalization. What about behavior, people ask me? Or what about self-report or violence? So let's talk about guns and violence, which I don't think I need to argue are, these are important phenomenon. People get killed, people get shot, and we have good measures on this, and we've done a lot of research on this. I'm going to focus on just a couple things. I'm going to sort of go into this like, well, why gun violence? I hope it's self-evident, but even in our data, there's evidence on the collateral consequences or legacies of exposure. One paper in Science Advances, Chuck Lanphier led, that shows that kids that are exposed or witnessed violence in adolescence are much more likely to carry guns. In other words, these are exposed to violence, not exposed to violence. 2-to-1 difference in carrying a gun. Of course, carrying a gun, you can't shoot somebody unless you carry a gun. This is, I think, an important finding. We're currently working on mortality. There is, and this is work in progress, but the same exposure variable seen someone being shot as an adolescent is related to all-cause mortality. Homicide in particular, which is probably less surprising, and health-related. And we were talking through the different mechanisms in the paper, but it makes sense in terms of things like allostatic load and stress and exposure to violence and so forth. But you can see that the ramifications of gun violence extend through the life course. So what about the social life course of gun violence? Well, they are cohort inequalities in witnessing gun violence, being shot, gun carrying, and gun use. Let me go through a few. This is a little bit different than the age arrest trajectories where we had yearly data. Here we're relying on survey data, so it's survey-based and interval censored technically. So these are survival type models or cumulative onset curves by cohort. Saw someone shot. These are high numbers. They're kind of shocking, but they're very much shaped by the cohort. So for example, the older cohort, about 50% compared to 20% of the younger cohort. So that's a significant difference. Not too many years apart meant a big difference in terms of the probability of our children witnessing violence. And this is, I think, important in terms of a social epidemiological fact, because you don't just have to be individually victimized. It's a very social thing when it is witnessed, it's talked about, it's sort of an environmental reality that I think has not been studied enough. And furthermore, using a gun actually carrying a gun and using it in a behavioral situation, is also shaped over the life course in distinct ways by cohort. So for example, again, the older cohort, which is the most disadvantaged, about 15% carried a gun versus, used a gun, compared to about 5% of the younger cohort. Gun carrying, we also looked at. I'm going to show you just a little bit different way to cut at the data, which I think might be useful in terms of understanding how you can think about these data, right? I'm showing age trajectories by cohort, but you can also look at historical timelines, and this is leading into the next section, right? Like, what's going on in terms of history? This shows the cumulative onset of carrying a gun by cohort by year, and then some key political events that were happening in the world. The dots are when kids turned 21. And if you trace it across, so for example, the younger cohort at 21, it's about 5% were carrying a gun compared to about 15% of the older cohort. And what you see is, interestingly, in the middle of the graph, it's kind of relatively flat or small steps up for the older cohorts. And the big increases are in the adolescent years here. And then you do see some increases in adulthood during the COVID, George Floyd era for the older cohorts. But in terms of things like presidential elections, when Obama was elected, even Trump, there's really not a lot going on in terms of the political events. It's really more about the upswing in violence in the 90s and this sort of period of reversal during COVID and the pandemic. I can come back to that a little bit later. But the point is, this starts to now motivate what I want to turn to, which is disentangling mechanisms of societal change. Now, the goal in the book, this is not a period analysis in the sense of, or secular change, trying to say, what caused the crime decline? People are always asking me this, and I'm like, well, I don't think anyone knows exactly. But that's a different question. I'm not even sure it's the right question, because I don't think there is one cause. There's a constellation of factors. And remember, we're talking about a relatively small historical period, 25, 30 years. My friend and colleague Orlando Patterson, a distinguished historical sociologist, we've had many conversations about this. And at first he was like, is that really history? and then I think I convinced him that it's a different kind of history. It's short-term history. It's a constellation of factors within a generation. And we've been having exciting conversations about this, actually. So let me tell you a little bit about what I think happened, or what are the different social worlds that these kids grew into or out of. And you've already gotten a taste of it, but I want to formalize it a little bit. I do more in the book, but I'm going to give you the easy graphs here and just show you some basic patterns. So the first is, which I think accounts for about at least 50% through various calculations of the criminalization differences, and that's just police regime changes, policing practices, the structure of policing. It changed dramatically, and it changed in ways that go against our common, or many common beliefs. You probably all know about broken windows policing, made famous in New York City, about the policing of minor things. I think of many of those things as things that kids do. I did as a kid. But disorder arrest, normalized, dropped like a rock. That's not because people are, less likely to be drinking a beer out of a paper bag. And the police size, which is the line that is basically flat, clearly can't explain it. So the police force is the same. There's different commanders, different police chiefs. They make different decisions. But overall, there was a blip, and we have a stop and frisk blip that goes up in the book that I talk about. But the disorder arrests in the era of broken windows dropped tremendously, which means the kids, and the key here is not so much the macro level change itself, but the columns are when each cohort turned 18. And you can see, like, well, basically right at the top, but when the younger cohort turned 18, it was 80% lower. So just a fundamentally different social world. What about drug arrests? Mass incarceration, drugs as a key driver of mass incarceration. Well, that is partially true. But the reality is, in the 2000s, roughly around 2005, drug arrests collapsed. Again, I don't think widely recognized. Dropped 75% in that short a period of time, which means that if you compare the three older cohorts to the younger cohorts, there was a sharp differential. And this, again, is within a 10-year period. So kids were still smoking pot. They still are. But you can't, well, if you really think about the differences now, and the startling differences, and it's actually somewhat tragic. I gave a talk in a maximum security prison about a month ago. And, someone asked me, like, well, I'm in for 30 years, but you can now walk down the street in any U.S. city and buy pot. And so it's like a cognitive shock when you think there's people in prison for what is normative. Now, that's drugs. It doesn't apply to murder, but the point is, at least for key aspects of criminalization, this is crucial for understanding, in my view, the birth lottery of history. The other thing, though, is that it's not just the state, it's not just policing. Behavior changed. Violence went down. This is a real thing. Others have argued this too, Pat Sharkey and many others. Violence went down as reported by citizens, and I consider that a good indicator of crime. And violent arrests went down. They're basically following each other. There's a little bit of a difference here. In the book, I formalize this and do simulations. What if we had the same policing intensity that we had in 1995, and what would be the expected number of arrests? And basically, the lines are the same. So it's really fundamentally, violence is changing. Cohorts are also aging through firearm homicide differences, and firearm homicide is very well measured. Firearm homicide is now pretty much all homicides in Chicago. And again, you can see this peak. Look at 1995. Again, that was the beginning of the study when Darnell was born, and then this just massive decline. And the differences are so large, by the way, that even among the older cohorts, the firearm change, for example, there was about a 40% drop from the 1981 to 1984 cohort, which made a significant difference in homicide. Now, the young cohort actually, during the 2019-21 period, at the tail end, the violence went up, and even though they're advantaged on every other dimension, got that hit of increasing violence. So it's not a unidimensional story. But property offending decline. And what about non-criminal justice? I go through in the book, not so much, it's not empirical analysis, but rather an assessment of the literature. And I think there's some very good candidates for thinking about sources of change that are what I will call social organizational and environmental. One is urban revitalization, and this has been written about a lot. I know, gentrification is a controversial topic. I think about it more, though, as cities really, in many areas of them, were reclaimed. I mean, areas that were spaces where people were afraid to walk, that there were no man's land. It wasn't just that there was litter. It was just that the spaces were not owned by the public. And through reclaiming, there's very interesting randomized clinical controlled trials on greening vacant lots that show reductions in crime. Part of it, I think, has to do with the sense in which spaces are reclaimed and people go out and there's more eyes on the street in a Jane Jacobs sort of way. So more social organization, people feel safe, they talk, there's interaction. Dare I say there's more collective efficacy in those neighborhoods because of that. Second, community-based organizations, which I've also written about, and Pat Sharkey's written about this and has a great paper in American Sociological Review showing that increases in community-based organizations, particularly focused on youth, using a clever but I think effective design, suggests that that accounts for about 10% or so of the crime decline in America. Sort of civic mobilization is how I think of it. Endogenous reaction to crime. Again, citizens reclaiming public space. That makes a difference. It's something I think that in the criminological literature that focuses so much on the police and reactive types of approaches, that these more social theoretical approaches have, I think, a lot to offer them. A third one is less unstructured time among youth. This is what I would call informal social control. This goes back, I think, to Crime in the Making and other work in criminology. That's kind of a basic concept. When kids are more likely to be supervised, then they're less likely to commit delinquency. Now we have lots of tools for that. It's kind of annoying, I guess, at one level, helicopter parenting. But parents do seem to know where their kids are more. By God, I'm glad I didn't have to go through that. But they seem to know. And technology, increasing surveillance, CRTV cameras. There's less cash. I was shocked even. I tried to pay for something the other day in London. No cash. We don't take cash. I was like, okay, it's a cashless society, less to rob. So there's that, and then normative shifts. I can talk about that more lately, but I think there's evidence of declining tolerance of violence. This goes, there's obviously a larger theoretical literature on normative shifts that theorists have written about that we can talk about, but I think that's linked into this too. Also, environmental change. This is a picture in the book that I took of, or that I have in the book, of Pilsen, which is a neighborhood has about 180 of our participants, that was closed off because there was a lead smelter plant there that had emitted toxins into the soil, and kids were playing in the grass and testing high in lead. Turns out that lead, again, is quite important, I think, as a correlate of delinquency. I've written about that. I never believed that it was a core source of the decline in crime in the United States, although some economists and others claim that it is, and I think it's a reasonable, plausible hypothesis, because if you look at the lead exposure decline, it is quite remarkable. This is based on the blood lead levels in our kids in about 1995 to 2013, arrayed by disadvantage, with the highest here being black poor neighborhoods, black non-poor, Hispanic non-poor, white non-poor. There's no white poor neighborhoods. There's a racial inequality, but all are declining, and now it's basically down to very, very low levels. The Department of Public Health in Chicago is a hero in my book. And so I think lead exposure is indeed one of the pieces of the puzzle. So it's this constellation of factors that change the social worlds. Okay, let's now get into the implications. I'm keeping on time here, I think. One is a big one. If you're going to think about social change and the implications in future directions, is prediction. One of the chapters in the book and in an article with others, we really probe this a lot to say, well, what would happen if we predicted the probability of arrest during the crucial ages of 17 to 24? We all know that's peak age of crime and so forth. If we take our older cohorts and we build a model, we can do quite well in calibrating it. If you look at the solid black line that we drew, and you compare that to the predicted, the actual probability of arrest compared to the predicted probability of arrest, you can see that we do a very good job. This is essentially following the kinds of models that people use out there in the risk assessment world, and in terms of the variables that we controlled, classic risk factors, used machine learning and the tools that one would use. I'm not going to focus on the fancy stats here. I'm just going to show you the basic result, which is when you apply that, in other words, the model that's trained on the older cohort, and you take those results and you do what's normally done and you apply that to the younger cohort, the predicted probability falls well below that line. It's what we called cohort bias. In other words, there's massive overprediction. Now you might say, well, that's just because crime dropped. And so then statisticians might say, well, you just need some kind of intercept shift model. But the problem is, I don't think it's a tweak, because the covariates excuse me, are changing as well. In other words, the relationship of the predictors, such as marital status, immigrant status, race, and you saw it with SES. You saw the change over time. So therefore, if the sources or the key predictors are themselves changing through historical time, then you can't just tweak that model, or there are ways to think about doing it, but it's really hard. And moreover, this is not racial bias. There's been a lot written about racial bias in prediction, but this occurs within each racial group. So it's an independent, unique source of concern or bias, is the way I would put it. So what do we do? I'll end with some thoughts on directions. One is to eliminate. In fact, I say in the book, the radical implication suggests eliminating all prediction, all thinking about individual risk factors, and all attempts to cater to individual character. It's not popular, I don't think. Motivations for crime and bad behavior will always exist, and as shown, attempts to predict them are rife with social change-induced error. Now, there are ways to think about modeling and social change, and I go through some of those in the book, but at best, I mean, we really do need to radically reform how we think about risk. Relatedly, cost-benefit analysis. That may seem boring. There's a lot of cost-benefit analysis. This childhood intervention program will save X amount of dollars. But think about it. It's the same logic. If, for example, the Perry Preschool Project or others estimate a certain dollar amount of savings, but that's based on an anomalous generation or cohort, then those costs or those benefits will be unlikely to be realized. And we are, I believe, making projections based on the past that are illegitimate. In the United States, for example, just last year, the White House put out a proposal to build more prisons and to increase arrests of super predators and so forth. But what is that based on? I mean, the crime rate has dropped even more this year. It's based on an imagination of the past, or not an imagination. I mean, there was a reality, but it's the current. It's sort of imprinted in the brain, or the political brain anyway, in certain areas, that is suggesting certain directions based on, in the best case scenario, cost-benefit analysis, but based on prior social worlds. That's a grave mistake. This is more policy-oriented, I suppose, although the cohort-based is too, because you really, I think, like city governments and state governments should be forced to update their cost-benefit analysis, their prison building costs and so forth, because pretty soon the prisons, they're not going to be empty, but there's another article coming out in the Annual Review of Criminology on the end of mass incarceration because of cohort effects, right? It's a non-replacement. These younger cohorts that are not being arrested and committing crime are not going to be going to prison. So all the costs in the building is essentially irrational. Cohort-based sentencing mitigation, I mentioned the marijuana example, but there are other examples that I'm thinking through and working on, and post-release support, that kids who went to prison at a certain age or missed out on certain social changes that really, I think, require us to rethink re-entry. Like, there's a lot been written on re-entry, but mostly from the viewpoint of individual risk factors and less so about, for example, the age of when people are being released. And let's not forget that in the US, at least, elderly prisoners make up an historically high proportion of the population for the very reasons I've been talking about. Another quickly is intergenerational transmission. And it, again, in a sense, the younger cohorts are doing so well that the idea of intergenerational transmission probably needs to be reconsidered, but really analytically, what this means is we should be thinking harder about parent-child in this birth cohort kind of perspective in different societies. And then theoretically, I end the book on a very abstract note and what I call a character trap, which is that the criminal histories, as I've shown, within criminal histories, history is baked in. So therefore, if we use the criminal history for sentence enhancement, for employment checks, for tenant checks, it's used everywhere. Algorithms are everywhere that are using our criminal histories. That, in a sense, is reinforcing further deprivation or severing the social ties that reduce criminality in an informal social control sense. So the character trap is, in a sense, working against us. And moreover, theoretically, despite what we say, character is still sort of resides at the level of the individual. And as Nikki Lacey has pointed out, there's been a resurgence of character-based thinking in the criminal justice system. So I think it's problematic that we need to rethink propensity. And this is not about denying accountability or moral accountability at the individual level. It's rather saying, let's up our considerations of character and moral accountability at the institutional level and at the societal level, or as I talk about at the end of the book, build social character, not just individual character. And finally, on the international scene, I think there's a lot of movement now, and I'd like to plug the appropriate British Journal of Criminology, exciting special issue of the British Journal of Criminology, Social Change in the Structural Context of Crime. Steve Harrell, lead editor, Philippe Estrada, and myself are working very hard, have commissioned papers. And the nice thing about this is that not every paper is taking the exact same framework, but every paper is concerned with issues of social change, and we have analyses from 6 European countries, Australia, the United States, Latin America. So really trying to think more broadly about changes around the world, and as I mentioned, if you change the level, this looks pretty much like the United States, right? This is England and Wales. Homicide rate, 1960, right? It's tripling. It came down, and it went up, and it's coming down again. It's kind of eerie in a way. Incarceration rate, clearly not at the same level, but it went up. And what's really interesting, maybe someone can tell me why, incarceration started going down in the United States 2010. Look at that. So something's going on that needs a macro international comparison in this cohort historical framework. And I'm hoping our journal special issue will spur even more of that. And some people in the papers are doing that. And so if I can end, well, actually I have one funny end, I hope. But on a serious thing, I'd say that what I think this offers is a general model, a cohort model birth lottery of history. And this is from actually the paper that Chuck and I are working on for the special issue. That is an analytic model that it's not really at the individual level. You can almost think of this as a meso level, right? Where you have social contexts are changing over time through historical change, but it's working through cohort differentiation. Now that's the classic insight of Norman Ryder and many others. And again, this is a venerable idea in the social sciences. I'm not saying anything new about cohort differentiation. I think it's gotten lost in much of our thinking. And like I said, I think it's like the air we breathe. It's social change is there so much so that we don't actually, it's a background and we don't build it into our theories. And then through age-graded context in the life course, as in the book, situated behaviors and reactions, both official criminalization and behaviors, affect people's lives, enduring, but they also, through cohort dynamics and replacement or non-replacement, for example, of criminals, change the future. And I think this is a generative way to think about crime. But it's not just crime. And since we're in England, I just saw this the other day and I had to show it. It's from the Financial Times. Want to predict central banker behavior? Look to their birth date. It's by Chris Giles. Pretty funny, actually. Seriously, looking at the Feds and the bankers, they all have different ideas depending on when they're born. Why? Well, it's kind of obvious in retrospect, because what they experienced during their formative years, or Carl Mannheim and the problem of generation tells us, basically when you're 17 to 25 or so, whatever's happening to them is, imprinting you. And so their decisions are apparently the birth lottery of history. Thank you.